which is our physical bodies. While we have no New Testament passage that would condemn tattoos, we do have a passage in the Old Testament. And I do want to turn to this because I believe that this will demonstrate God's heart on the matter of tattoos. Again, we cannot bind the Old Testament passage, although I want you to entertain the idea that the Apostle Paul wrote to Timothy, and he said that all Scripture is breathed out by God and is profitable for doctrine, for correction, for reproof, or instruction, that the man of God may be perfect, thoroughly furnished unto every good work. Now, when Paul penned those words, the New Testament did not exist. We also know that Paul told the Christians in Rome that the things were written aforetime were written for your learning, that through patience of the Scriptures we might have hope. And so we understand, and I think I misquoted Paul in Romans slightly, but we understand that God made a judgment on this topic in Leviticus chapter 19. And I want us to go there, but I also want you to think about something else that is written in Malachi. And I'm not going to ask you to turn there today, and it's not on the screen. But in Malachi chapter 3 and in verse 6, Malachi says, and he's quoting God, "For I, the Lord, do not change." That very simple statement at the beginning of verse 6 of Malachi chapter 3 simply states that God is the same. And we could look at other passages as well, both Old and New Testament, that would tell us that God does not change. But in thinking about Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 28, I'm going to read just this verse, and we will revisit this passage. So if you're going to turn to another passage, please put your marker there. Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 28 says, "You shall not make any cuts on your bodies for the dead, or tattoo yourselves. I am the Lord." And so we see God makes it very clear. And as I've also mentioned, the word tattoo does not appear in the King James Version. And this is one instance where the King James Version very closely follows the Hebrew language. And it says, "Make any markings on your skin." That's an almost literal word-for-word translation from the Hebrew language there in the King James. Now today we have the word tattoo. That does not mean that this is a mistranslation or misrepresentation. In fact, it merely means that we are speaking the modern English language. But we have God's heart and God's judgment on this. Now, consider with me, why did God say this in Leviticus? Because we have to ask ourselves that question. And this is where many Christians and I would differ. We have to ask ourselves the question, what is going on in Leviticus chapter 19? And in verse 26, why would God forbid tattooing? Now, I looked into the history of tattoos. I love the internet for this. Research is much easier than it used to be. But you can't believe everything on the internet. And so take what I have to say for a grain of salt, do your own research, and see if you reach the same conclusion. Now, history is something that what history says about something does not make a topic right or wrong on its own. But I believe in this application, history will help us to understand where God's coming from. And tattoos. Historians, scientists tell us that tattoos date back somewhere to around 337 BC, and that is not the right date. It's 3000 something BC, because I did the math on it, and it would place the earliest tattoos before Noah's flood. I believe I'm missing a 0 in there. But that would place the earliest tattoos before Noah's flood. And I want you to consider that during that time period, the world was destroyed because people had gotten so far away from God. Now, again, in the English language, tattoo did not come about, the word tattoo didn't come about until 1700 AD or thereabouts. Now, that does not mean tattoos didn't exist. Tattoos were made in almost every pagan culture throughout history. Some of the most prominent tattoos were made in Egypt. The children of Israel were coming up out of Egypt in Leviticus chapter 19. And God is basically telling them what all they have to do differently to be His people, rather than to be involved with the pagan practices that they were accustomed to in Egypt. Okay? We can also look at other places throughout the world. Roman Empire was very prominent with tattoos. The Greek Empire was very prominent with tattoos. There are several others. They found frozen bodies in various places throughout Europe. They found mummified bodies in Egypt. They have found, I believe, remains of bodies in Alaska with tattoos. And so we've got, they're scattered around the globe. And so tattoos have been very prominent throughout pagan culture. However, in the Christian age, tattoos were almost completely annihilated because of the Christian stance historically on tattoos. Oddly enough, in the Egyptian culture, I found this very intriguing. And again, it doesn't answer all of the questions, but I think if we go back, and we're going to in a little bit, we're going to go back to Leviticus chapter 19, and we're going to look at the context of that one verse that we looked at. We're going to look at the paragraph that it's in and the paragraph below. And I think it explains a lot of the culture of Egypt when we know the history and compare it and mesh it with the scriptures. But oddly enough, in Egypt, in the Egyptian culture, women were the primary object of the tattoo artist. I thought that was interesting. Because historically, in our society, men, particularly, those who were mighty rebels, you might say, the military men, that, they sailors. Steve was in the Navy, I think. You were Army, right, Don? Okay, but your dad was Navy. Okay, so they could probably relate to this. Sailors would get the tattoo on their arm or something along those lines. Historically, in our society, it's been men who get tattoos. Not so in the Egyptian culture. Very few mummies have been found in the Egyptian culture with tattoos. We'll get to that in a moment. There was an Egyptian priestess, Hathor, I believe is the name that she goes by today, whether that's her, but she was mummified. And so they know very much the tattoos, the patterns of her tattoos, and historians tell us that many Egyptian priestesses were heavily tattooed. In fact, many Egyptian women were very heavily tattooed. The objects, though, of the tattoos, with both the Egyptian priestess as well as the common Egyptian women who received tattoos, the primary focus was sexual in nature. And part of that they recognized because of the parts of the body that bore the heaviest tattooing. And so history tells us that. With that in mind, I want us to go back And I want us to look at something. And really the secondary reason that the Egyptian culture tattooed was they tattooed in memory of the dead.